Today, it's no longer an option for companies not to be actively involved or compliant with ESG in their business. It truly is a must, and it's crucial both from a business, societal, and planetary perspective. Now, ESG refers to three factors: environmental, social, and governance. But how can you make sure to monitor and rest assured that your providers are compliant through the whole supply chain? Now, this often requires a huge amount of manpower and also hands-on work. But there are ways, more effective ways, to solve this, not least with new technology. And this is where the importance of using ESG data for evaluation comes in hand, and the need to understand and develop ESG goals for efficiency and profitability. Here to talk about ESG, monitoring, automation, and also how machine learning really can be an initiator, I'd like to say a warm welcome to Rochelle March, Head of ESG Product and Resident Expert at Dun & Bradstreet, joining us via link from the United States. Thank you so much for joining us, Rochelle.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So I wanted to start off. Now, you're leading Dun & Bradstreet's valuable contribution to the ESG landscape. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to ask you if you could define ESG.
Certainly. Well, you did some of it in your introduction. ESG stands for Environmental Social Governance, and it's a new type of data that helps us understand how companies are managing themselves, particularly their resources, whether that's environmental, like energy, water, social, their employees, customers, the societies they work within, or how they're governing their companies, hopefully in an accountable and transparent manner.
And as I mentioned in my introduction, I mean, we're seeing such a focus on sustainability and ethics, and as that is a result of ESG also becoming more increasingly important to integrate into companies and investments. In your view, what are some of the catalysts for this?
Definitely. So generally, it's an evolution of cultural values, really, that companies should do more than just return financial profits. They should contribute to the communities they work within, to society at large, be responsible stewards of nature. But more recently, we've seen some very palpable impacts from climate, from lack of equality in societies, as well as lack of ethics around algorithmic transparency, for example. These are really causing disruptions. So all of that is shining light on the need for ESG data, as well as accompanying regulation on ESG disclosure and management.
And if we look at sustainability and CSR, I mean, traditionally it maybe was more connected to the sustainability department, a good to have, but now it's really been leveraged to another stakeholder level where, leadership is really at its perk, where CFO, CEO, CPO, they all have to be integrated in the strategy of ESG, not least. How would you say that companies are adapting to this change and also, really taking on this responsibility and leadership?
Yeah, so like you said, CSR, sustainability, corporate social responsibility, it used to be a side part of companies for the most part. And it was how a company could do good through philanthropy, volunteering, and so on. But now companies are hearing ESG sustainability from multiple angles, whether that's through the investor relations, investors really wanting to know what companies are doing for this, through HR, where employees want to work for a company that aligns with their values, or through the supply chain, where they need to deal with reputational issues from sourcing or lack of supply, other types of disruptions, and so on. So the world is changing, and companies are starting to hear about this change through multiple avenues. How they adapt requires, these companies to adapt. In the last couple of years, we've seen every company become a COVID company. How do you operate in a world that's being affected by a pandemic? Every company has to become a climate company, an ESG company. That's our next challenge in terms of evolving and adapting to a changing planet.
And I know a question that pondered before, and some might still ponder on it, even though it should become more and more obvious. And that is, can we really marry profit and purpose and, require that planet profit people? What's your take on that? Sort of, how can you explain, yes, that can be married?
Yes, it can be married and it should be married because, it's not going to be a happy marriage without putting both of these things on the same playing field. And the only reason that they have not been married in the past is because we did not value planet on the same playing field as, say, business and economic activity. Water, for example, is rarely priced according to the actual supply of water that's available. It's often underpriced, for example. We don't price greenhouse gas emissions, although we're starting to see that in a lot of countries through carbon taxes and emission trading schemes and so on. So in order to put them on the same playing field, you need to understand how valuable planet is. And you see companies starting to do that. I mentioned Tesla, that made profits not from the sale of its cars, but from the sale of emission credits to other companies that couldn't keep up with their emission goals because they only sell electric vehicles. So very interesting shift in business models and how you can marry the profit and planet.
Mm. And also this notion that it is actually, our planet or nature who is also facilitating us to make profit and to use the renewable resources. Looking at, so the previous decade has been a lot about ESG corporate practices through debate, through legislation and so forth. And now we're going into the next decade where we really want ESG to be a call to action and really be established as a norm. How do you foresee, or expect this to become a norm?
Definitely. Well, I 100% agree with you. This is the time for action. If we don't get climate under control, our waste under control, how we treat different parts of our societies in a more equitable manner, I'm not sure we'll make it, in the future, or at least a place that may not be progressively better. So this decade is really about integrating and putting together those metrics, the tracking, the monitoring, the operational processes to make ESG part of the business and part of the business activity. When you're onboarding a supplier, you have to go through due diligence, a number of processes, add ESG. When you're giving a loan to a business, you have to understand their background, their historical financial performance, references, look at ESG as well. These are all components that will help integrate ESG into the regular business activities and really implement different practices and influence different policies to help us get on track to a more sustainable trajectory.
Mm. And looking at data and technology, because of course what Dun & Bradstreet's focus on a lot is the merge of data and technology. So if we look at that aspect and look how it can help us improve the ESG capabilities, what would you say?
Well, it's extremely important to have the data, which can be its own challenge within itself, and then also to organize it, track it, and then be able to present it and in a way where many stakeholders can make use of it, whether that's through dashboards or through dissemination of the information reports or so on. I can't tell you how many customers I talk to who are still tracking ESG data from many different areas on spreadsheets manually. This is going to be error prone. You're not going to get the most frequent amounts of data. So it's very important to leverage the tools and the software and the instruments we have to make sure that we're using data as quickly as possible and that it is informing as many decisions as possible as well.
Measurement is truly key because when we can measure, we can also see the effect. I also want to just ask, do you see or foresee any sectors that maybe already are or will become the trailblazers of really implementing ESG, SDGs, and all of this into their business core?
Sure. So I think there are two sectors in particular that have been leading, potentially because they already have a lead and are relatively low footprint and ample resources. Big part of the economy is technology and financial sector. Technology has led a lot in the environment, although TBD in terms of how they will handle things like algorithmic transparency and effects on society. We've seen a lot of instances in the news about that today. And then the financial sector has a real vested interest in risk mitigation according to their investments. Many of the returns, particularly in pension funds or institutional investors, are wrapped up in sectors like fossil fuel and others that are not always aligned to where the world needs to go in terms of a low carbon economy. So I think we will see these two sectors continue to lead, but ESG affects all. And I'm sure we will see leaders within all different types of sectors, whether it's manufacturing, energy, retail, or so on, that are also going to lead in their own practices.
And sort of to sum it all up, because we can say like this, there is a sense of urgency, as we all know. And if we look maybe 5 years ahead, because we live in exponential times, and sort of addressing to leaders and businesses, what would you say is a key priority to really get ESG into motion and action into businesses going forward? What do you hope to see?
Definitely. So I think a key driver will be regulation, particularly around the consistent standard expectation of what companies need to track. I think the most important piece to track would be greenhouse gas emissions, because we really need to stabilize the climate, in the next decades, or, the effects of that can be very catastrophic. So I think that will be a very important driver, and what is needed, because today it's mostly been voluntary, this disclosure, and it's very, confusing. It's hard to compare. We need that guidance from regulation on a global level to really get that standard consistent measurement, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions, I believe.
And also to make sure that regulation is at the same speed as the evolvement of technology. And it's always a collaborative approach. Rochelle, thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights and for all of the work you do, and best of luck going forward. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us today. I hope it's been a fruitful, insightful, and interesting discussion, and hopefully a catalyst for all of you to really drive your businesses, of course, with data, but also with a sustainable and ethical mindset. So thank you all for watching this time. Hope to see you soon again. And with that, stay safe and stay healthy.